There was a world before the gods arrived, not the world you imagine when you hear those ancient names, Anu, Enlil, Enki, but an older world, quieter, already ancient when the first temples rose in Mesopotamia, a world that existed in the long silence before anyone thought to carve creation itself into clay. This is not the story of how the world began. This is the story of what was already there, what was forgotten, and what ended when the gods descended from the sky. Tonight, we return to the oldest fragments, the whispers beneath the myths, and listen carefully to what the texts actually say about the time before divine order. If you're settling in for the night, you might dim the lights now. Let the room grow quiet. Let the ancient world emerge slowly from the dark. If this kind of journey speaks to you, if you find meaning in these forgotten silences, you're welcome to subscribe or leave a like, but only if it feels right. And if you'd like to be part of this quiet community, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. We read every one. Now let us go back, further than most stories dare to go, into the world that was lost before the gods. The earth was old already. That is where we must begin, not with creation, but with age. Not with the first light, but with the darkness that stretched before anyone thought to name it. The Sumerian texts, the oldest we possess, do not describe an empty void waiting for divine hands to shape it. They describe something stranger and more unsettling. They describe a world already formed, already full, already breathing with life that predated the order the gods would impose. In the earliest fragments, before the great organizing myths were written down, there are hints of landscapes that existed without names, of waters that flowed before anyone declared them sacred, of beings who walked and worked and died before the first king claimed descent from heaven. The texts call this time the time before measurement, before the sacred arts, before the divine names were spoken into being. It was not chaos exactly. It was something quieter. It was a world that simply was, without justification, without destiny, without the weight of cosmic meaning pressing down on every stone and river. Imagine that world for a moment. Not the gleaming cities of Uruk or Ur, not the ziggurats rising like mountains of brick toward the sky, but the landscape that existed before any of that. The marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates dissolved into 1,000 smaller channels, creating a maze of reed beds and shallow waters. The texts suggest this region was inhabited long before the Great Flood narratives, long before the gods established their sacred cities. There were settlements there, small and unnamed in our records, where people lived close to the water, harvesting fish and birds, cutting reeds for shelter, moving with the seasons. These people left almost nothing behind that survives in the archaeological record. No grand monuments, no inscriptions declaring their kings or their conquests. They are shadows in the deepest strata, known only by the absence of the divine names that would later saturate every aspect of Mesopotamian life. They lived, the texts suggest, without temples, without the elaborate rituals that would come to define civilization in that region. They lived, perhaps, without the gods at all. This is difficult for us to grasp, raised as we are on narratives that place the divine at the center of human origins. But the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest attempts to organize history, makes a striking claim. It states that kingship descended from heaven. Not that it emerged from human communities, not that it developed organically from social need, but that it descended, came down, was given, was imposed from above. This phrasing is deliberate. It suggests that before this descent, there was something else, a time without kingship, a time perhaps without the social hierarchies that kingship implies. The text does not romanticize this earlier time, it simply acknowledges it existed. Before the divine order, before the sacred cities, before the tablets that recorded debts and grain yields and temple offerings, there was life that left no record, no trace in the official histories that would be written by scribes serving divine kings. The question that haunts these earliest texts is this: what happened to that older world? Not in the sense of geological catastrophe, though floods certainly reshaped the land many times, but in the sense of memory and meaning. How does a world vanish so completely that only fragments remain, hints and whispers in texts written thousands of years after the fact? The answer, the texts suggest, is that it was replaced, deliberately, systematically. The arrival of divine order was not simply an addition to what existed, it was a transformation so complete that the earlier world ceased to be comprehensible in its own terms. It could only be understood eventually as the time before, the prologue to the real story, the darkness before the light. In the Sumerian poem, sometimes called the Eradication, there is a passage that describes the earliest state of the world. It does not begin with gods creating. It begins with cities that did not yet exist, with sacred rites that had not yet been performed, with a time when the land was not yet divided into territories claimed by divine patrons. The text states that in those days there was no snake, no scorpion, no hyena, no lion, no wild dog, no wolf. There was no fear, no terror. This is often read as an idyllic vision, a golden age before danger entered the world. But if we read carefully, we notice something else. The text does not say there were no dangers. It says there were no names for them, no categories, no divine assignments of meaning. The world existed, in a state before taxonomy, before the great organizing project that would assign everything its place in the cosmic hierarchy. Animals existed, certainly, but they had not yet been sorted into clean and unclean, sacred and profane, useful and dangerous. They simply lived. And humans lived among them, the texts suggest, in ways that are now difficult to reconstruct. Before agriculture became the basis of civilization, before cities required vast grain surpluses to feed their populations, there were other ways of being in the world. The marshlands of southern Mesopotamia supported communities that relied on fishing, on hunting, waterfowl, on gathering the resources of the wetlands. These people appear in later texts only as vague references, as populations that existed before the great works began, before the canals were dug and the fields measured and the temple precincts established. They are the Eridu people, the people of the first place, though even that name comes from later texts, attempting to organize a past that had no such organization in its own time. They fade from the record not because they ceased to exist in an instant, but because the world that made sense of their existence was replaced by a world that could not accommodate them except as a vanished prologue. The texts speak of 7 sages, the Apkallu, who brought civilization to humanity. These were not human sages, the traditions make clear, but supernatural beings sent by the god Enki before the Great Flood. They taught the sacred arts, writing, building, ritual, law. They established the foundations of the organized world. This narrative is repeated in many forms across Mesopotamian literature, and it reveals something important about how later cultures understood their own origins. Civilization did not develop, it was given. It was taught by beings from elsewhere, by entities who possessed knowledge that humans did not and could not discover on their own. This is a story about dependence, about hierarchy, about the fundamental incapacity of humans to organize themselves without divine intervention. And it is also, implicitly, a story about erasure. If civilization had to be taught, then what existed before the teaching was not civilization. It was something else, something the texts treat as essentially formless, meaningless, waiting to be shaped. But formless things leave traces. In the deepest archaeological layers of sites like Eridu, before the great temple complex was built, there are older structures, simple reed huts, small shrines that show no signs of the elaborate ritual apparatus that would come later, offerings of fish bones and bird remains. These are the material remnants of a religious life that existed before the gods as we know them were worshipped, before Enki was lord of the freshwater abyss, before Inanna was queen of heaven and earth. There were practices we can barely interpret, oriented toward powers we cannot name, conducted by people whose languages we do not know. The clay beneath the temples is older than the temples. The marsh existed before anyone thought to drain it and plant barley. The world was there, breathing, living, already full of meaning. Before the gods arrived to declare what meaning would be, the texts are careful in their way to acknowledge this. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, does not describe creation from nothing. It describes the organization of existing materials. In the beginning, the text states there was Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean. These are not gods creating the world. These are primordial entities, often described as principles or forces rather than conscious beings in the way later gods would be. From their mixing, the text suggests, other things emerged, but the key detail is that they were already there. The world did not need to be created, It needed to be ordered, divided, assigned, measured. The project of the gods was not to bring something from nothing but to impose structure on what already existed, to separate earth from water, to name the sky, to establish boundaries and categories and rules, to make the world legible, comprehensible, controllable. And in that process, something was lost. The texts do not celebrate this loss, they simply record it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the hero mourns his friend Enkidu, he describes him as one who was born in the wilderness, raised among the animals, who lived free of civilization before being brought into the city. Enkidu's death is one of the great tragedies of ancient literature, and part of what makes it so devastating is the recognition that Enkidu represented something that cannot be reclaimed, a way of being in the world that existed before the city, before kingship, before the elaborate social structures that define civilized life. Gilgamesh loves him precisely because he embodies this lost connection to the wild world, to the time before divine order imposed itself on every aspect of existence. When Enkidu dies, something irreplaceable dies with him. Not just an individual, but a mode of existence, a relationship with the world that cannot be recovered once civilization has taken root. The texts return again and again to this theme of loss, of worlds that ended when new orders began. In the Atrahasis epic, the story of the flood begins not with human wickedness, but with human noise. The gods, the text states, could not sleep because of the clamour of humanity. This is a strange and revealing detail. It suggests that the flood was not a moral punishment, but an administrative solution. Humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive of divine peace. The gods decided to reduce the population, to impose a limit on human flourishing. One god, Enki, intervened to save a remnant, instructing Atrahasis to build an ark. But the text is clear about what was lost in the flood. It was not just individuals who died, it was entire ways of life, entire communities, entire landscapes that were swept away. After the flood, the text describes measures taken to control human population: infant mortality, infertility, celibate priestesses. The world that emerged after the waters receded was a managed world, a world where divine authority extended into the most intimate aspects of human life. The world before the flood, by implication, was freer, less controlled, more dangerous perhaps, but also more open to human autonomy. We must be careful not to romanticize this earlier world. The texts do not present it as paradise lost. They present it as a time that existed without the structures that would later make life comprehensible and meaningful within the framework of Mesopotamian civilization. It was not better or worse, it was different, and it could not survive contact with the divine order that descended from the sky. This is not a story about inevitable progress, about humanity climbing from savagery to enlightenment. This is a story about replacement, about one world ending so another could begin, about the silence that falls when the old names are forgotten and new names take their place. The divine names themselves are instructive. An, the sky god, whose name means simply sky. Enki, whose name means Lord of the earth. These are not personal names in the way we understand them. They are descriptive titles, labels that assign cosmic domains to particular divine authorities. Before these names were spoken, the texts suggest the sky was simply the sky. The earth was simply the earth. They were not territories claimed by specific gods, not portions of a divine bureaucracy that administered reality from heaven. They were simply what they were, vast and impersonal and indifferent to human concerns. The act of naming them, of assigning them to gods, was the act of making them comprehensible, yes, but also the act of making them subject to divine control. The world became smaller when it was named, more meaningful perhaps, but also more confined, more obligated, more burdened with the weight of cosmic significance. In the hymns and prayers we see this burden reflected in the lives of ordinary people. Before the gods established their temples, there were no temple duties, no labour obligations to maintain the divine households, no tithes of grain and oil and livestock, no festivals requiring participation and expense. These things came with the gods, with the divine order that organised society around sacred centres. The texts describe this as a gift, the establishment of sacred spaces where heaven and earth met, where prayers could be heard, where the forces that governed reality could be approached and appeased. But they also describe, sometimes inadvertently, the cost of this gift. the endless labour required to maintain the temples, the constant anxiety about offending the gods through ritual errors, the fear that drove people to offer more and more, hoping to secure divine favour, in a world where famine, disease and war could descend without warning. The world before the gods, if we read the text carefully, was a world without this particular kind of fear. There were dangers, certainly, but they were natural dangers, dangers that could be understood and sometimes avoided through skill and knowledge. They were not the capricious dangers of divine displeasure, which could strike without warning and without obvious cause. The story of the Anunnaki themselves complicates this picture further. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki are not clearly defined. They appear as a group of gods, sometimes associated with judgment, sometimes with the underworld, sometimes simply as the assembly of divine beings. Their name may mean something like offspring of Anu, the sky god, but even this is debated. What is clear is that they represent a particular kind of divine order, collective, bureaucratic, organized into hierarchies and councils. They are not wild gods, not chaotic, forces of nature. They are administrative deities, gods who meet and deliberate and make decisions about the cosmos and its inhabitants. And the texts suggest they arrived. They came from somewhere else. The phrase descent from heaven appears repeatedly in contexts that make clear this was not metaphorical. The gods were not always present in the world. They came to it, established themselves in it, and in doing so, transformed everything. What did they find when they arrived? The texts offer only fragments, glimpses of a world that had already been living its own life for countless generations. They found marshlands teeming with life. They found people who had lived there since time beyond memory. They found a landscape that was sacred in its own way, according to logics we can no longer fully reconstruct, organized around centers of meaning that were not temples in the later sense, but places that held power, springs, groves, unusual rock formations, places where the ordinary world seemed thin and something else pressed close. These places were already old when the Anunnaki descended. They were incorporated into the new divine order, sometimes given new names, new mythologies, new ritual requirements. But the power that made them sacred existed before anyone thought to build a temple there, before any god claimed them as a personal domain. The transition was not instantaneous. The text suggests generations of overlap, of older ways persisting alongside newer divine structures. In the king list, the earliest dynasties are described as lasting impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years in some cases. Scholars read this as mythological time, as the compression of entire ages into single reigns. But it also suggests a recognition that the transition from the old world to the new world was not a single event but a long, slow transformation. Communities that lived in the old ways gradually, over many lifetimes, became communities organized around temples and divine kingship. Languages changed, technologies changed. The stories people told about where they came from and why they existed changed. And with each change, the memory of the earlier world grew dimmer, more fragmentary, harder to access except through the careful reading of texts that were themselves written long after the transition was complete. There are passages in Sumerian literature where this loss breaks through, where the text seems to mourn what was forgotten. In a lament for the city of destroyed by invaders, the poet describes not just the physical destruction, but the silencing of the old songs, the dispersal of the people who remembered them, the end of ways of doing things that had been passed down since the time before time. The destruction of a city, the text suggests, is not just the destruction of buildings and walls. It is the destruction of worlds, of entire frameworks of meaning and memory that cannot be reconstructed once the people who carried them are gone. If this could happen to great cities like how much more complete was the destruction of the older, smaller, unnamed settlements that existed before the divine order established itself? They left almost nothing, a few pottery shards, some shell middens, ghost outlines of structures visible only to archaeologists with sophisticated tools. They are there in the earth, evidence that the world was full and living before the gods, but they cannot speak to us in their own voices. We know them only through the silence where their stories should be. The silence is important. It is not empty silence, not the silence of nothing. It is full silence, the silence of something that existed but cannot be recovered. When we read the ancient texts about the coming of the gods, we must read them knowing that they were written by the victors of a cosmic reorganization. The scribes who recorded these texts served kings who claimed divine descent, They worked in temples dedicated to gods whose authority rested on the claim that before they arrived there was only formlessness, only chaos, only the raw material waiting to be shaped into civilization. The texts are, in this sense, propaganda, though that word is too harsh and modern for what they are. They are the official history of the victors, and like all such histories, they tell us more by what they omit than by what they include. What they omit is the experience of those who lived through the transition, who watched the old ways fade, who perhaps resisted, who certainly grieved even if they also welcomed some aspects of the new order. We catch glimpses of this grief in unexpected places, in medical texts that preserve remedies using plants and techniques that seem to predate the elaborate pharmacopoeia of later Mesopotamian medicine, in agricultural texts that mention older methods, older crop varieties, older ways of reading the sky and the land, in ritual texts that prescribe actions whose meanings are no longer explained, actions preserved because that is how it has always been done, even though no one remembers why. These are the fossils of the earlier world, embedded in the later text like shells in limestone, evidence of life that existed before the stone formed around it. The texts also preserve memory of beings who are not gods in the later sense but who exercise power in the world before the divine order consolidated itself. These beings have many names: spirits of place, demons, monsters, chimeras. Later mythology would organize them into hierarchies, assign them roles in the cosmic bureaucracy, or cast them as enemies of the gods to be defeated in primordial battles. But the earliest references suggest something more ambiguous. These were entities that belonged to the land itself, that emerged from specific places and could not be fully controlled or domesticated by the arriving gods. Some were dangerous, some were helpful, some were simply indifferent to human concerns. The important detail is that they existed independently of the divine order, and their presence suggested that the world had its own power, its own agency, its own ways of operating that did not require divine permission or oversight. The god Enki's relationship with these entities is particularly revealing. In myths where he establishes cosmic order, he does not destroy these beings. He negotiates with them, he assigns them territories, he sets boundaries around their power. This suggests that even from the perspective of the victorious divine order, the older powers of the land could not be simply erased. They had to be accommodated, incorporated, given roles in the new system, even if those roles were diminished and controlled. The texts describe Enki travelling through the world, visiting various locations and establishing their divine assignments. This spring will provide water for this city, this river will mark this boundary, this mountain will be the dwelling of this lesser deity. But implicit in these descriptions is that these places already had their own character, their own power, before Enki assigned them new meanings. He was not creating from nothing. He was reorganizing, relabeling, incorporating into a system of meaning that originated elsewhere, that came from the sky rather than emerging from the earth. We might think of the world before the gods as a world of horizontal relationships, places connected to other places through rivers and trade routes and migrations, communities connected to other communities through kinship and shared language and mutual needs, humans connected to the land through daily labor and intimate knowledge of seasons and weather and the behavior of animals. These were direct relationships, immediate and practical. The coming of the gods introduced vertical relationships. Humans below, gods above, earth below, heaven above. The profane world of daily life below, the sacred world of temples and rituals above. Every action, every object, every person was positioned within this vertical hierarchy, given a rank and a role and a degree of closeness to or distance from divine authority. This reorganization was totalizing. It touched every aspect of existence. And it meant that the older, horizontal ways of relating to the world became not just obsolete, but incomprehensible. They could not be practiced within the new framework because the framework itself made them impossible to conceptualize. The texts suggest that this transition involved violence, though the violence is described in cosmic rather than human terms. The god Marduk's defeat of Tiamat in the Enuma Elish is the most famous example. Tiamat, the primordial ocean, is defeated and her body is split to create the ordered cosmos. Scholars debate what this myth means. Is it a memory of actual historical conflict? Is it a metaphor for the imposition of order on chaos? Is it a seasonal drama about flooding and drought? All of these interpretations have merit. But what the text clearly describes is the destruction of something primordial, something that existed before the gods, in order to create the world as Mesopotamian civilization knew it. Tiamat is not evil in the early parts of the myth. She's simply old, belonging to a time before time, and her existence is incompatible with the divine order that Marduk will establish. She must be killed not because she has done wrong, but because she represents what came before, what must be surpassed, what cannot be allowed to continue if the new order is to take hold. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The old must be defeated so the new can flourish. And with each defeat, memory of the old fades a little more. The text preserves the outlines of these stories, but the details, the human experience of these transitions, the daily reality of living in a world being transformed, these are lost. We know that the transformation happened. We can trace its effects in the archaeological record, in the sudden appearance of monumental architecture, in the development of writing systems designed to track temple inventories and royal decrees, in the reorganization of settlements around central sacred precincts. We can see that the world changed. But the experience of that change, for those who live through it, remains largely inaccessible to us. We can only imagine it, guided by the fragments the texts preserve. One fragment that suggests the complexity of this transition appears in a Sumerian text describing the distribution of divine offices. The god Enki travels around the world assigning various functions to various locations and deities. He gives fertility to some places, wealth to others, craft skills to others. He establishes which gods will oversee which cities, which natural forces will be controlled by which divine authorities. The text presents this as a generous act, a distribution of blessings across the earth. But it also describes something else, the complete reorganization of the world according to a plan that originated from above, from the divine realm, without apparent consultation with those who already lived in the places being assigned new purposes. The cities mentioned in this text already existed. They had populations, histories, ways of life that had developed over generations. But those local realities are invisible in the text. What matters is the divine assignment, the decision made in heaven about what each place will mean in the cosmic order. This suggests that the people living in these places experience the coming of the gods not as an unambiguous blessing, but as a profound disruption. Their local gods, their local practices, their local stories about origin and purpose. All of this had to be either incorporated into the new system or abandoned. Some communities successfully negotiated this transition, maintaining some of their older identities even as they adopted the new divine framework. Others did not. They appear in later texts, if they appear at all, as defeated enemies, as populations that resisted divine order and were punished for it, or simply as nameless others who existed before the true history began. The texts do not record their perspective. We can only infer it from the gaps, from the places where the official history seems to skip over something, to move too quickly past a transition that must have been much more complex and painful than the triumphant narratives suggest. The pain is sometimes visible even in texts that celebrate the divine order. In Laments for Destroyed Cities, poets describe the gods abandoning their temples, leaving their people to be conquered and enslaved. These texts are full of grief, full of incomprehension at how the gods could allow such devastation. But they also reveal something about the nature of the relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian thought. The gods were not reliable protectors. They did not love their people in any simple sense. They were powerful beings who might offer protection and blessing, but they might also withdraw, might become angry, might decide that a city had served its purpose and could now be destroyed. This is a terrifying theology, a worldview in which divine favor is always conditional, always uncertain, always at risk of being withdrawn. And it raises a question. Was the world before the gods, for all its dangers and uncertainties, actually more terrifying than the world the gods created? Or was it simply terrifying in a different way, in a way that did not involve the constant anxiety of trying to please beings whose moods and motivations were fundamentally alien to human understanding? Modern interpretations of these texts often assume that the coming of the gods was an unambiguous good, that the establishment of civilization represented progress from a more primitive state. This interpretation is understandable. We live in civilizations ourselves, we benefit from the structures of law and administration and specialized labor that characterize organized societies. It is difficult for us to imagine life outside such structures except in terms of lack, of absence, of something missing. But the ancient texts themselves are more ambiguous. They recognize that civilization brought great achievements: writing, monumental architecture, complex art and literature, the ability to organize large populations for collective projects. But they also recognize that these achievements came at a cost. The texts preserve memory, however fragmentary, of what was lost when the divine order established itself. They do not advocate for returning to the earlier world, but they do not pretend that nothing was sacrificed in the transition. The figure of the wild man appears repeatedly in these texts as a symbol of this lost world. Enkidu is the most famous example, but there are others. These figures are always described as living outside civilization, without knowledge, of bread or bear, clothed in animal skins or not clothed at all, dwelling in the wilderness among the animals. Later tradition would make them into monsters or enemies of civilization, but in the earliest texts they are more ambiguous. They possess knowledge that civilized people have lost, knowledge of how to survive in the wild, how to track animals, how to read the land. They are strong in ways that civilized people are not. And when they are brought into civilization, something in them dies. Enkidu becomes weak after he sleeps with the temple prostitute and the animals flee from him. His integration into civilized life is also his diminishment, his loss of the wild power that defined him. The text does not moralize about this, it simply describes it as a fact. You cannot belong to both worlds. You cannot be both wild and civilized. The choice of one requires the abandonment of the other. This pattern extends beyond individual figures to entire populations. The texts occasionally mention groups who live at the margins of civilization: desert nomads, mountain tribes, marsh dwellers. These groups are described in terms that suggest they retained ways of life that predated or refused the divine order. They did not participate in the temple economy. They did not recognize the authority of the divine kings. They lived according to older patterns, older rhythms, older relationships with the land. The civilized texts regard them with a mixture of fear and contempt, describing them as savages, as less than fully human. But this description itself suggests that these groups represented something that the civilized world found threatening: the possibility that the divine order was not universal, not inevitable, not the only way to organize human life. As long as these groups existed, they were living evidence that other worlds were possible, that the transformation was not complete, that the memory of the time before could not be fully erased. Over time, of course, these marginal populations were absorbed or destroyed. The expansion of agricultural civilization required the conversion of more and more land to farming, the control of water sources, the elimination of spaces that remained outside the administrative reach of temple and palace. The wild places shrank. The populations that depended on them were forced to choose, integrate into civilization, or be pushed further into the margins, into increasingly marginal lands that could support fewer and fewer people. By the time the great cuneiform libraries were compiled, the world they described was a world almost entirely organized by and for the divine order. The earlier world existed only in fragments, in hints and echoes, in stories that were told but no longer fully understood. And yet those fragments persist. They persist because the texts, even when celebrating the divine order, could not entirely suppress the memory of what came before. They persist because the very claim that the gods brought order implies the existence of something before that order, something that had to be transformed or defeated or incorporated. They persist because the questions these texts raise: where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What gives life meaning? What happens when worlds end? These questions do not have simple answers, and the texts know it. The official answer is that the gods created the world for their own purposes, and humans exist to serve them. But alongside this official answer, the texts preserve traces of deeper, more troubling possibilities. Maybe the world existed before the gods. Maybe humans already had lives and purposes before divine kingship descended from heaven. Maybe something was lost in the transition that can never be recovered. Maybe the silence at the heart of these texts, the gaps and absences and forgotten names, maybe that silence is trying to tell us something about the cost of order, the price of civilization, the worlds that must die so other worlds can live. The texts do not answer these questions directly. They could not. They were written by scribes trained in temples, serving kings who claimed divine authority, working within a system that made those questions almost impossible to ask clearly. But the questions are there, embedded in the myths and hymns and laments, waiting for careful readers willing to listen for what is not said as much as what is said. The world before the gods was not paradise. The texts make that clear. It was a world of struggle and danger, where humans were small and the forces of nature were vast and indifferent. But it was also a world that existed on its own terms, without the burden of cosmic significance, without the weight of divine expectations, without the elaborate structures of meaning that would come to define Mesopotamian civilization. It was a world that we can barely imagine now, a world that left almost no direct evidence of itself, a world that exists for us only in the form of absence, of silence, of the places in the text where something should be but is not. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of this story. Not that we should mourn the lost world or celebrate the arriving gods, but that we should recognize what every great transformation costs. The world that existed before the Anunnaki was not inferior to the world that came after. It was different, and its difference meant that it could not survive the coming of divine order. The two worlds were incompatible. One had to give way to the other. The texts, written from within the world of the gods, naturally present the transformation as necessary and good. But they also preserve, whether they mean to or not, the memory that it was a transformation, not a creation from nothing. That something ended when something else began. That the world was already old, already full, already living its own life before anyone thought to organize it according to divine will. In the deepest part of the night, when the world is quiet and the boundaries between past and present feel thin, these old texts can still speak to us. They speak not in the language of absolute truth or historical fact, but in the language of memory and loss, and the things that remain when almost everything else has been forgotten. They tell us that worlds can end even when the earth itself continues, that civilizations can arise on the ruins of other civilizations, on the silence of people who had no voice in the official histories, that every order, no matter how powerful, no matter how convinced of its own necessity, rests on the forgetting of what came before. And they tell us, if we listen carefully, that the silence itself is a kind of speech, a testament to what existed, a marker of absence that points toward fullness we can no longer access except through imagination and careful reading and the willingness to sit with uncertainty. The world that existed before the gods is lost to us. The texts say so. The archaeology says so. The vast distance of time says so. We cannot bring it back. We cannot even fully understand it, embedded as we are in civilizations that are themselves the descendants of that ancient transformation. But we can acknowledge it. We can read the old texts not just for what they tell us about gods and kings and creation, but for what they reveal, often inadvertently, about the worlds that had to end so those gods and kings could rule. We can sit with the uncomfortable possibility that every beginning is also an ending, that every victory writes itself over a defeat, that every light casts shadows where older lights once shone. This is not a comfortable story. It is not meant to be. The texts are not comfortable either, not when we read them carefully, not when we pay attention to what they are really saying beneath the official narratives. They are texts written at the intersection of worlds, texts that remember dimly that there was a before even as they celebrate the after. They hold within them the tension of that transformation, the violence and loss and terrible necessity of replacing one world with another, and they ask us thousands of years later to witness that loss, to acknowledge it, to carry the memory of it even though we cannot change it, even though the world of the gods has itself now faded into ruins, and we read about it the way the scribes read about the world before the gods, through fragments, through silences, through the careful interpretation of what remains when almost everything is gone. If you are still listening, if you have travelled with us this far into the deep past, perhaps you understand now why these stories matter, not because they tell us literal truths about how the world began, but because they tell us something true about how worlds end and begin, how memory is formed and lost, and how we live always in the wake of transformations we did not witness but whose effects shape everything we know. The story of the Anunnaki has taken on a life of its own in modern imagination. This is worth examining, not to mock or dismiss, but to understand why these ancient fragments have been reinterpreted in ways that often bear little resemblance to what the texts actually say. In popular discourse, the Anunnaki have become ancient astronauts, genetic engineers who created humanity as a slave species to mine gold for their dying planet. This narrative appears in countless books, documentaries, and online discussions. It presents itself as hidden truth, as knowledge suppressed by mainstream archaeology and academia, and it is, in its way, a compelling story. It offers clear answers to profound questions. It provides villains and victims, cosmic drama played out on a grand scale, and the appealing notion that humanity's origins lie not in slow evolution, but in deliberate design by advanced beings from elsewhere. The appeal of this interpretation is understandable. It transforms ancient confusion into modern clarity. It takes fragmentary texts full of gaps and uncertainties and weaves them into a coherent narrative that feels complete, that feels like it explains everything. The texts speak of gods descending from heaven. Modern interpretation reads this as spacecraft landing. The texts describe gods creating humans to serve them. Modern interpretation reads this as genetic engineering and slavery. The texts mention the Anunnaki working in the earth. Modern interpretation reads this as mining operations. Each ancient phrase is given a technological explanation, each mythological image decoded as literal historical fact, viewed through primitive understanding. But if we return to the texts themselves, if we read them in the languages they were written in, if we examine them within the context of Mesopotamian thought and culture, a different picture emerges. The texts do not describe mining operations. They describe the establishment of cosmic order, the distribution of divine responsibilities, the foundation of civilized life. The Sumerian term that is sometimes translated as mining or digging niku appears in contexts that suggest agricultural labor, the digging of canals, the preparation of fields. The texts describe the gods as needing workers to maintain their temples, to provide offerings, to perform the rituals that sustain the divine order. This is not a story about gold mining for distant planets. This is a story about the religious and economic foundations of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, about how temples functioned as centers of agricultural production and redistribution, about how labor was organized and justified through mythological narratives that placed humans in service to divine powers. The modern interpretation reads these texts as if they were trying to describe material facts using inadequate vocabulary. The ancient texts, this interpretation suggests, speak of gods because the people did not have words for aliens or genetic, engineers or advanced technology. But this reading imposes modern categories onto ancient thought in ways that distort both. The Mesopotamian concept of divinity was not simply a primitive way of describing powerful beings. It was a sophisticated framework for understanding power, order, hierarchy, and the relationship between human and cosmic realms. The gods were not powerful because they had advanced technology. They were powerful because they embodied and controlled fundamental aspects of reality: the sky, the earth, the waters, fertility, kingship, wisdom, war. Their power was not technological but ontological. They were what they governed. They were not separate from their domains but identical with them. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about how these texts were understood by the people who wrote them and the cultures that preserved them for thousands of years. The texts were not encoding hidden scientific knowledge. They were expressing religious and philosophical truths about the nature of reality, about humanity's place in the cosmos, about the sources of legitimate authority, about why the world is organized the way it is. To read them as if they were really talking about something else, something more real or more scientific than what they appear to be saying, is to miss their actual meaning and significance. It is to treat ancient people as if they could not express what they actually meant, as if their words must be decoded to reveal what they really intended to say. But the texts say what they mean. They describe a world ordered by divine powers, where humans exist to serve those powers, where civilization is a gift from the gods, where proper ritual and obedience maintain cosmic order. This worldview is not a primitive encoding of modern knowledge. It is a coherent way of understanding reality that made sense within its own framework. The modern reinterpretation also misses something crucial about the texts, their ambiguity, their internal contradictions, their preservation of multiple perspectives and traditions. The ancient scribes who compiled these texts did not attempt to create a single unified narrative. They preserved different versions of stories, different names for the same gods, different explanations for the same events. They lived with uncertainty and multiplicity in ways that modern reinterpretations, with their drive for coherent answers, cannot accommodate. The texts suggest that the world before the gods was formless, but they also describe it as already inhabited, already full of life. The texts describe the gods as creating humans, but they also describe humans as already existing before the great divine works began. These are not contradictions that need to be resolved. They are tensions that the texts hold, recognizing that ultimate origins are mysterious, that no single story can capture the complexity of how the world came to be as it is. The focus on the Anunnaki specifically is also revealing. In the ancient texts, the Anunnaki are not the most important gods. They appear in various contexts, sometimes as judges of the underworld, sometimes as the assembly of gods, sometimes as the 7 great gods. They are important, certainly, but they are not central to most mythological narratives in the way that gods like Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and Marduk are. The modern fascination with the Anunnaki specifically, rather than with the Mesopotamian pantheon more broadly, seems to stem partly from the exotic sound of the name and partly from its association with Zecharia Sitchin's theories. Sitchin's books, beginning in the 1970s, popularized the idea of the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts, and his interpretations have been enormously influential in alternative history circles. But Sitchin's work is based on idiosyncratic translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, translations that professional scholars of these languages have consistently rejected as inaccurate and unsupported by the linguistic evidence. His reading of the texts imposes meanings that the words do not actually carry, connects passages that have no connection in the original context, and ignores the vast body of Mesopotamian literature that does not fit his thesis. This is not to say that everyone who finds the ancient astronaut interpretation compelling is foolish or gullible. The appeal of these ideas speaks to real needs and real questions. In a world where mainstream institutions often fail to address people's search for meaning, where official histories can feel disconnected from lived experience, where technology has advanced so rapidly that the idea of ancient advanced civilization seems plausible, alternative narratives offer a sense of hidden knowledge, of seeing beyond the veil, of understanding truths that others miss. The ancient astronaut theory provides cosmic significance to human origins, suggests that we are connected to vast, interstellar dramas, offers the possibility that ancient wisdom was more advanced than modern people recognize. These are powerful appeals. They speak to the same human needs that the ancient myths themselves addressed. The need to understand where we come from, why we are here, what our relationship is to powers greater than ourselves. But we can address those needs without distorting what the ancient texts actually say. We can find meaning and significance in the texts as they are, in their complexity and ambiguity, in their preservation of multiple traditions and perspectives, in their honest acknowledgement that ultimate origins remain mysterious. The texts do not need to be about ancient astronauts to be profound. They are profound because they grapple with fundamental questions about order and chaos, about human purpose, about the costs of civilization, about memory and loss. They are profound because they were written by people who are as intelligent and thoughtful as we are, who struggled with the same questions we struggle with, who created frameworks of meaning that sustained entire civilizations for thousands of years. To read them carefully in their own terms is to encounter minds that are fully human, fully sophisticated, fully capable of expressing what they meant to express. The world that existed before the gods, as the texts describe it, was not a world of primitive savages waiting for alien intervention. It was a world of people who lived complete lives, who had their own ways of understanding reality, who had relationships with the land and with each other that were meaningful and coherent within their own contexts. The coming of the gods, as the texts describe it, was not a genetic engineering project, but a profound transformation of how life was organized, how meaning was structured, how authority was justified. This transformation was real. It happened. We can see its effects in the archaeological record. But it was a human transformation, driven by human needs and human choices, producing human institutions, temples, cities, writing, kingship, that would shape the course of civilization for millennia. To read these events as if they were really caused by external intervention from space is to diminish the human achievement they represent and to miss the human cost they exacted. The texts tell us that the world before divine order was already meaningful. They tell us, if we read carefully, that the transformation was not simply good or simply necessary. They preserve memory of what was lost, and they ask us to consider what it means to live in a world organized by powers we did not choose, according to purposes we did not set, following rules we did not make. These are not questions about ancient aliens. These are questions about power, about legitimacy, about the foundations of civilization, about who benefits when society is organized in particular ways. The ancient texts raise these questions more honestly and more profoundly than modern reinterpretations that reduce everything to a simple story of advanced beings manipulating primitive humans. The real story is more complex, more ambiguous, and more relevant to understanding our own world and our own place, within structures of power and meaning that we inherited but did not create. So when we encounter claims about ancient astronauts and genetic engineering and mining operations, we can appreciate them as modern myths that serve contemporary needs. But we should also return to the ancient texts themselves, reading them with care and respect, listening for what they actually say rather than what we wish they said. We should recognize that ancient people were capable of sophisticated thought, of religious and philosophical reflection, of creating meaning without needing intervention from beyond their world. And we should acknowledge that the questions these texts raise, about where we come from, about the cost of order, about the worlds that ended so our world could begin, these questions remain urgent and unanswered, and no simple story about ancient aliens will resolve them. The texts offer something more valuable than easy answers. They offer the chance to sit with difficulty, to accept ambiguity, to live with questions that cannot be fully resolved but must be carried anyway. The world before the gods returns to us now as we near the end of this journey. Not as historical fact that can be reconstructed with certainty, not as hidden truth that has been suppressed, but as absence, as silence, as the gaps in the record where something existed but left no clear trace. This absence is not nothing. It is the shape of something that was real, that mattered to the people who lived it, that shaped the world even though we cannot fully recover it. The texts preserve this absence even as they celebrate the divine order that replaced what came before. They cannot help but preserve it because every story of beginning must acknowledge, however implicitly, that there was something before the beginning, something that the beginning transformed or destroyed or incorporated. In the quiet of this moment, as the night deepens and the boundaries between past and present grow thin, we can feel the weight of that absence. All the people who lived before the divine order established itself, all the ways of life that made sense in that earlier world, all the stories they told about where they came from and why they existed, all the names they called their gods or the powers they recognized in the land, all the songs they sang and the rituals they performed, and the knowledge they accumulated about how to live in their particular place at their particular time. All of this is gone. Not destroyed in an instant, not erased by catastrophe, but gradually replaced, slowly forgotten, carefully written out of the official histories that would define what it meant to be civilized, to be human, to be worthy of being. Remembered. The texts tell us this happened. They tell us that kingship descended from heaven, that the sacred arts were taught by supernatural beings, that civilization was a gift from the gods. These narratives served important purposes. They justified the power of kings who claimed divine descent. They explained why society was organized hierarchically, with some people closer to the gods than others. They provided meaning and structure in a world that could seem chaotic and arbitrary. But they also required the forgetting of what came before, the suppression of alternative ways of organizing life, the silencing of voices that might question whether the divine order was as natural and inevitable as it claimed to be. We live still in the wake of that transformation, distant descendants of civilizations that were themselves descendants of those first cities and temples. The structures of power and meaning that began with the divine kingships of ancient Mesopotamia have evolved and changed, have been challenged and reformed, but they have never been entirely left behind. We still live in hierarchies. We still seek legitimacy from sources beyond ourselves. We still organize society around centers of power that claim authority over vast territories and populations. We still ask the questions the ancient text asked. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What gives life meaning? What happens when worlds end? And we still struggle, as the ancient text struggled, to hold together the tension between the order we need to survive and the memory of what was sacrificed to create that order. The world before the gods asks us to remember that every order rests on forgetting, that every civilization is built on the ruins of what came before, that every confident claim about how things must be carries within it the suppressed memory of other possibilities. This is not a comfortable recognition. It does not provide clear answers or simple solutions. It does not tell us what to do or how to live. It simply asks us to acknowledge that the world is always more complex than our stories about it, that the past is always partly unknowable, that the people who left no records were nonetheless fully human, fully alive, fully real. Their silence is not proof that they did not matter. It is proof only that they could not speak in the language of power, could not write themselves into the official histories, could not preserve their worlds in forms that would survive the transformation that swept over them. This is what the ancient texts preserve, if we read them carefully. Not just the official narratives of divine order and human purpose, but the traces of what those narratives had to suppress, the gaps where something should be but is not, the moments when the texts almost remember what came before they begin. These traces are precious. They are all we have of worlds that left almost nothing behind. They remind us that history is written by the victors, but that the defeated still existed, still lived, still mattered. They remind us that every story of origin is also a story of ending, that every beginning writes itself over something that was already there. They remind us to listen for the silences, to attend to the gaps, to recognize that what is not said is often as significant as what is said. And so we come to the end of this journey, back to the quiet room where you are listening, back to the present moment that is itself, always passing into the past, always becoming part of the long chain of forgetting and remembering that connects us to those ancient worlds. The world before the gods is gone. It has been gone for thousands of years. But its absence shapes everything that came after. The divine order that replaced it was a response to it, a transformation of it, an attempt to organize what was already there according to new principles and new purposes. The cities and temples and writing systems that we associate with the beginning of civilization were built on foundations that preceded them, using knowledge accumulated by people whose names we will never know, drawing on traditions that reached back into the deep past beyond the reach of any written record. When we read the ancient texts about the coming of the gods, we are reading documents created by that divine order to justify itself, to explain itself, to perpetuate itself. This does not make them false or worthless. It makes them human. They are products of human needs and human choices, expressions of how certain people at certain times understood the world and their place in it. They deserve to be read carefully, respectfully, with attention to what they actually say and the context in which they were written. They do not need to be decoded or reinterpreted or rescued from their own limitations. They are what they are, sophisticated attempts to make sense of profound questions about origin and order, about power and purpose, about the relationship between human life and the larger forces that shape it. The world they describe, the world of gods and temples and divine kingship, is itself now part of the past. The temples are ruins. The gods are no longer worshipped. The certainties that sustained those civilizations have long since dissolved. We read about them the way they read about the world before the gods, through fragments, through careful interpretation, through the attempt to understand ways of life that are foreign to our own. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of these texts, that all worlds are temporary, that every order, no matter how powerful, no matter how convinced of its own necessity, eventually becomes a ruin for others to puzzle over, that the silence that claimed the world before the gods will eventually claim our world too, that the best we can do is to live thoughtfully within the worlds we inherit, to question the orders we're born into, to remember what was sacrificed so those orders could exist, and to preserve what we can for those who will come after, who will read our ruins the way we read the ruins of Mesopotamia, trying to understand what we believed and why we lived the way we did. In the texts, there is a recurring image that speaks to this. It appears in laments, in wisdom literature, in royal inscriptions. It is the image of the abandoned city, the silent temple, the place where life once flourished but now only wind moves through empty streets. The texts describe this with deep feeling, with grief that crosses the millennia. They mourn not just the physical destruction, but the silencing, the ending of a world, the cessation of voices that once filled the air with prayer and conversation and song. This image appears so often in Mesopotamian literature because it was a recurring reality. Cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, ways of a life ended. The world kept transforming, kept moving, kept replacing one order with another, and each time those who experienced the transformation mourned what was lost, even as they adapted to what came next. We can feel this grief in the texts if we read them with attention to their emotional dimension. The laments for destroyed cities are not just literary exercises. They are expressions of real loss, real suffering, real grief at the ending of worlds. When the poet describes the gods abandoning their temples, the people being led away into captivity, the silence falling over what was once alive with activity, we are reading the testimony of someone who knew what it meant to see a world end. And that testimony connects us, across the vast distance of time, to the human experience of loss and change, to the difficulty of living through transformations we did not choose and cannot control. This is why these ancient texts still matter, not because they contain hidden scientific knowledge or secret truths suppressed by mainstream scholarship, but because they express with honesty and depth the human experience of living in a world shaped by powers beyond our control, of trying to make meaning in the face of overwhelming forces, of dealing with loss and change and the constant tension between order and chaos. The people who wrote these texts were not primitive. They were not waiting for modern people to decode their real meaning. They were sophisticated thinkers grappling with the fundamental questions of human existence, and they created texts that have survived for thousands of years because those questions remain urgent, because the experiences they describe remain relevant, because the grief they express still resonates with anyone who has seen a world end or felt the weight of inheriting an order they did not create. The world that existed before the gods reminds us that our own world, as solid and inevitable as it seems, is itself temporary, contingent, built on the forgetting of what came before. The structures we take for granted, our cities, our technologies, our ways of organizing society, our sources of meaning and authority, all of this rests on transformations that happened long ago, on choices made by people we will never know, on the silencing of alternatives that might have led to different worlds. We live in the aftermath of countless transformations, inheritors of orders we did not establish, but which shape everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. And the texts ask us to remember this, to carry the weight of it, to acknowledge that every order excludes something, that every beginning is also an ending, that the silence at the foundation of our world is full of voices we can no longer hear. Where are you now as you listen to this? What time is it where you are? Are you drifting towards sleep, or is this journey keeping you awake with questions you cannot answer? The ancient texts would understand either response. They were written for people who knew sleepless nights, who lay awake wondering about where they came from and why the world was as it was, who found some comfort in the stories their culture told, but who also felt the gaps in those stories, the places where the official narrative did not quite explain everything. The texts speak to that experience of uncertainty, of living with questions that have no final answers, of making meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to human purposes. As this long night comes to its quiet end, as the story circles back to silence, we can rest with what we have learned, not facts that can be stated with certainty, not definitive answers to the questions we brought, but something perhaps more valuable, a sense of the complexity of the past, of the humanity of those who came before, of the cost of transformation, of the worlds that had to end so other worlds could begin. The texts preserve this knowledge, not in the form of clear statements, but in the form of tensions they hold, contradictions they cannot resolve, silences they cannot fill. They ask us to sit with this difficulty, to accept that some things cannot be known, to recognize that the past is not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be acknowledged, a weight to be carried, a silence to be respected. The world before the gods is not coming back. The transformation that began thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia set in motion patterns that spread across the entire world, until almost every human community lives under some form of organized state, some version of the divine order that first descended in those ancient cities. The old ways, the horizontal relationships, the life lived close to the land without the intervention of administrative hierarchy, all of this has been almost entirely absorbed into the vertical structures of civilization. We cannot return to it. We can barely imagine it, but we can remember that it existed. We can honor its memory by refusing to take our own world as natural or inevitable. We can carry the knowledge that other ways of being were possible once and might be possible again, even though we cannot clearly see what they would look like. This is the meaning we carry from this journey into deep time. Not that the past was better or worse than the present, Not that ancient texts contain hidden truths waiting to be discovered, but that history is made by humans, that orders are established through choices and power, that memory and forgetting are always political, always shaped by who has the authority to tell the official story. The texts from ancient Mesopotamia are honest about this in ways that modern retellings often are not. They acknowledge that the divine order was established over something that came before, that the world was already old when the gods arrived, that the transformation was not simple or costless or instantly complete. They preserve, even as they celebrate the divine order, the traces of what that order had to suppress. The memory of worlds that had to end so civilization as we know it could begin. In the deeper silence of the night, these traces speak. Not loudly, not with certainty, but they speak nonetheless, asking us to remember, asking us to acknowledge, asking us to carry the weight of what was lost so that we might better understand what we have inherited and what we might yet choose to transform. The world is always ending and beginning. The divine order that seemed eternal to those who lived under it has itself now ended, become ruins, become texts for others to interpret. And our own world, as solid as it seems, will one day be ruins for others to puzzle over, trying to understand what we believed and why we lived the way we did. This is not a sad thought, though it carries sadness within it. It is simply the truth of how time works, how worlds work, how human meaning-making works. We are always in the middle of the story, always inheriting from the past and shaping the future, always living with questions we cannot fully answer but must carry anyway. The ancient texts understood this. They were written from within the same uncertainty, the same position between what came before and what would come after. And they ask us, across the millennia, to join them in that uncertainty, to accept that we will never know everything, that the silence will always be part of the story, that the worlds that ended are as important as the worlds that began. Rest now, if you can. Let the ancient world fade back into the darkness. Let the questions remain questions. Let the silence be silence. The world before the gods is gone, but its absence shapes everything. The memory of what was lost travels with us, even when we do not name it, even when we do not consciously carry it. It is there in the gaps in our histories, in the places where the official story skips over something, in the ruins that speak of worlds we can barely imagine. It asks nothing from us except acknowledgement. It offers nothing except the reminder that we too live in a world that will one day be before, a world that will one day exist only in fragments, in silence, in the careful reading of those who come after, trying to understand what we were and what we believed, and what ended when we ended. The night is quiet now. The story is told. The world that was lost before the gods remains lost, but we have touched its edges, felt its absence, honoured its memory. That is all we can do. That is enough. Sleep well, if sleep comes, and if you are awake still, wondering, questioning, feeling the weight of these old silences, know that you are doing what the texts themselves do, holding the tension between knowing and not knowing, between certainty and mystery, between the world as we understand it and the worlds that existed before our understanding could reach them. This is the gift of history, the burden of memory, the calling of those who read the old texts and listen for what they are really saying beneath their words, to carry what was lost, to acknowledge what ended, to live thoughtfully within the orders we inherit, knowing they are neither natural nor inevitable, knowing they rest on forgetting, knowing they will themselves one day be forgotten. This knowledge changes nothing and everything. It cannot bring back what is gone, but it can make us more honest about what we have, more careful about what we preserve, more humble about what we know. And in the deep night, when the world is quiet and the ancient past feels close, that might be enough.